I'm in Florida this week, and outside there's a typical late afternoon thunderstorm rolling in through Kissimmee. So there might be the sound of rain or the sound of thunder as we move through today's episode, but here, inside, we are focused again on the life of Disney artist Herb Ryman. I'm recording this on July 15th. That's 2 days before Disneyland's 68th anniversary. And in our story about Herb Ryman, we are moving through the work he did to create Disneyland back in 1954 and 1955. So this is the perfect episode to drop on the week of Disneyland's anniversary. When we left off last time, Ryman had made that map that helped sell Disneyland in New York, and today we're going to follow Ryman and Walt Disney as they design the park and move toward its opening. So let's see. All of my recording equipment and my laptop is running through grounded outlets. The AC is set to 70 degrees and the curtains are closed so that, at least in here, we can imagine it's the mid-1950s. So I think that I'm all set for today's episode. If you're all set as well, let's roll. Throughout 1954, Walt hired more live-action art directors and architects to design his park. These individuals would be particularly useful in designing themed areas that resembled backlot sets, particularly for Main Street, Frontierland, and Adventureland. He also moved artists from Walt Disney Productions, particularly from the layout and background departments, over to WED to develop concepts for individual rides and attractions. These individuals, with their backgrounds in animation, were particularly useful in designing elements for Fantasyland and, to a lesser extent, Tomorrowland. Beyond the artist, Walt and Roy hired a business executive to oversee Disneyland Incorporated, also a team of managers to sell sponsorships to American corporations and to lease space to large and small companies interested in opening shops inside the park, particularly in the retail areas of Main Street and Frontierland. During these months, Ryman came to understand that Walt saw the various environments in his park as a means to communicate emotion, similar to the way that live-action directors created sets to convey a narrative feeling to moviegoers. A movie set, Ryman knew, was often arranged to both establish a sense of place and impart a specific mood. Many years earlier, when Ryman had worked on the Bastille set for A Tale of Two Cities, he had altered the historic fortress to make it appear a little darker, a little more menacing, thereby overlaying a narrative mood onto the presentation of a historic building. Walt was incorporating the same strategy to design his park. Adventureland, with its thick foliage and dark water, suggested a sense of the unknown and, at times, a sense of danger. Fantasyland, with its festive, colorful design, suggested whimsy. Main Street, with its low buildings and soft colors, suggested comfort and familiarity. Beyond this, there was something else in the park's design that appealed to Ryman. As a boy, he had explored National Geographic magazines for hours, wondering at all of the cultures and environments across the world. Now he was helping Walt to recreate distant environments in the middle of Southern California, sections of the park that embraced the architecture and geography of Asia, Africa, and Europe. Disneyland, once it opened, would be many things to many people, but for some, it might be an updated and more immersive version of those old National Geographic issues that Ryman had once loved. A way for kids in California to escape into exotic locations without traveling far from home. Even after Ryman began work on the park, the drumbeat of his personal career, at least at times, still beat loudly inside his chest. The illustrated edition of The Black Rose had sold so well that its author, Thomas Costain, asked Ryman to illustrate his next novel, which would be published in 2 volumes. The books were called The Tontine Volume 1 and The Tontine Volume 2. Despite the frantic work unfolding inside of WED, Herbie asked for 6 or 7 weeks off to illustrate these 2 books. Walt somewhat reluctantly agreed. Over the weeks that followed, Ryman created complex line drawings to illustrate the 2-part novel. Unlike his work as a studio sketch artist, he focused his drawings for the Tontine more on the characters than on the locations. In this way, he was, again, braiding together skills from different parts of his life into a new pursuit. These drawings relied on skills of portraiture, mixed in with those he had developed as a studio sketch artist. The final drawings were, at times, equally focused on locations central to the novel and its characters. When he returned to WED, he found that the design team was even larger than when he'd left. Walt had hired a wave of architects and structural engineers who were translating artists' concepts into buildable designs. Another set of Disney employees, mostly machinists and engineers, were developing vehicles and ride systems, such as for the Peter Pan attraction and for the railroad. But most of the ride work was being outsourced to companies that specialized in those endeavors, such as Aero Development in San Jose and Todd Shipyards in San Pedro. When Dick Irvine spotted Ryman, he took him over to Walt. "Hey, Walt," Irvine said, "Herbie's back." Walt turned slowly to take in his old friend, who stood there in a white shirt and thin blazer. Walt appeared pleased, though also a little annoyed. He gestured behind him to indicate all the work that had been done in his absence, the drawings, the models, and site plans. His expression suggested that the more important artistic developments were happening here, not at Ryman's home studio, even if those 2 books would ultimately have Ryman's name on them just below that of the author. "Hi, Herbie," Walt said. "I just wanted to let you know that we could get along without you." Following his gaze, Ryman took in the room, where he saw people gathered around drafting tables. Unsure how to respond, he said, "I knew you could, Walt. That's the reason I left." With that, the conversation was over, but it gave Ryman something to think about how he might value any outside offers in the near future that he wanted to pursue. Ryman quickly got back to work, helping to design the park. He worked on designs for Tomorrowland, Fantasyland, and Main Street. He produced interior and exterior designs for Snow White and Her Adventures. His job, as he understood it, was to put on paper the nebulous ideas that we all had about the way Disneyland would take form. These designs would not only help create the park, but would be used to pitch material to bring in outside companies for sponsorships and lessee contracts. In this way, Ryman, through his art, helped bring in new funding streams to the park. For a back section of Adventureland, he worked on sketches for a small pirate area, featuring a pirate shack and Bluebeard's Den. The small collection of structures were positioned to face the river, a set of buildings sketched in the style of 18th century architecture that was featured in the Disney film Treasure Island, released in 1950. If built, this would be one of the few places where live-action features created by Disney would influence his park. But this pirate area was soon put on hold, as Walt needed to pick and choose which areas he could most efficiently build. As work continued, budget became the key constraint, the one that forced Walt to delay some plans and abandon others. Among those concepts that fell away was a scale model railroad, much like the one he had once arranged in his backyard, the circus cul-de-sac, an area devoted to the celebration of holidays, a monorail, and a haunted house. Eventually, Walt began to think of his park as developing in stages, with some areas built once the park was open and when Disneyland Incorporated had more money. One key architectural icon that never left the park was the castle. Early plans were loosely modeled on the Neuschwanstein Castle in the Alps, with its gray and blue turrets. The Disneyland Castle was first designed with sketches, then with paintings, then with a small-scale model. Once approved, a larger model was built, about 3 feet tall, with multiple pieces that could be moved and repositioned. After the large model was finished, Dick Irvine and Marvin Davis asked Ryman to review it. "We want to know what you think," they said. Ryman walked around the model, viewing it from different angles. He understood that Walt wanted a castle related to his fairy tales, but the model that he saw reminded him of the Neuschwanstein Castle, which had been claimed by the Nazis during World War II. The castle had been used to store art that the Germans had stolen, largely from France, for a museum that Hitler wanted to open after the war. Its location in the Alps, far from Berlin, kept the art safe from aerial attacks. It was almost surely the structure's connection with the war to which Ryman reacted, as a model of Neuschwanstein would break the dreamlike cinematic atmosphere that Walt wanted to create in his park and remind at least a few visitors of cultural and political realities that existed outside of Disneyland. "Do you really want me to tell you what I think of it?" Ryman asked. Irvine and Marvin indicated that they did. "It's a mistake," Ryman said. "You've done a copy of Mad Ludwig's Bavarian Neuschwanstein. It's very obvious that's what it is. You've used the same stonework, you've used the same fenestration, you've got the same barge board. Everyone's going to know what it is, and they're all going to say Walt Disney has no imagination." Ryman could see that both Irvine and Davis were upset. The model, Ryman could see, was beautiful, but the inclusion of a full Neuschwanstein design allowed the civic realities of the 20th century to enter the park, same as if Disneyland had included an architectural presentation of Westminster from London or the United Nations from New York. "If I've said something wrong," Ryman said, "I'm sorry, but that's the way I feel." In the days that followed, Ryman assumed that others working on the project, specifically model maker Fred Jerger, would alter the castle so that its appearance wasn't so closely tied to Neuschwanstein. But a couple of weeks later, when Ryman returned to the presentation room for a group meeting with Walt, he was surprised to find that the model hadn't been changed in any way. "Hey," Ryman said, "you guys haven't changed this." Irvine and Davis checked the room to make sure Walt hadn't arrived. They were alone, but even among themselves they had little to say about the model. Once more, Ryman walked around the castle, but this time he saw that the model was modular, with some movable sections. "I could see that the top of it was detached," Ryman said. "I touched it and saw that it wasn't glued on, it wasn't cemented." Ryman held the section that held the upper turrets in his hands. He saw now that the section that most resembled Neuschwanstein were the windows, archwork, and turrets that faced Main Street. "I picked the whole thing up, the top part of it, and turned it around and reversed it," he said. The section that originally faced Main Street now faced the courtyard in Fantasyland, and the part that originally faced Fantasyland now looked out onto Main Street. There were some elements that, from a historical perspective, didn't quite fit in this new arrangement. For example, a castle would never have a glass window directly above a drawbridge, as the front of a traditional castle was designed as a series of walls to stave off intruders. But as Ryman looked at it, he believed that the overall appearance was more inviting now than the way it had originally been built. Don't leave it that way, Irvine said. Walt will be here in a minute. Ryman stepped back to look at the model from a distance. He found that he liked its appearance, with the lone high turret now on the right. That's not perfect, he said, but nobody will know that you've copied Neuschwanstein. At that moment, all of the men heard noise behind them, the sound of another person breathing. They turned to see Walt standing there dressed in a dark jacket, white shirt, and black tie. From his expression, they understood that he had heard most, if not all, of their conversation. Walt continued into the room. He looked at the model from one side, then the other. The structure's familiar design elements were repositioned to suggest that Walt's castle, though birthed by Neuschwanstein, was now something new. I like that a lot better, Walt said. As plans came together and as Walt's vision solidified, he began to express his design philosophy to Ryman, one that was pointedly anti-industrialist and in ways anti-urban. You know, Walt said, tyrants in the past built these huge buildings. Look how big and powerful I am. And they towered over the people just to impress the people. Ryman immediately understood the point of contrast. Walt's park would feature buildings smaller than those found in the outside world. The castle, of course, would be substantially smaller than the one found in the Alps, but the shop buildings on Main Street and in Frontierland would also be slightly smaller than similar structures outside the park. The use of scale was a subtle way to explain how guests should feel at Disneyland. In Disneyland, guests were more important than the structures around them. The park was sized to make people feel big and not to draw attention to the executive who envisioned the park. Walt wanted the buildings all kept at a size that people would feel very friendly, Ryman explained. They wouldn't be overpowered by the architecture. But even as Walt came to articulate his design philosophy, he didn't always understand how the tools of set design could deepen the sense of familiarity he wanted guests to find in the park. Concepts of broken scale or forced scale architecture were relatively new to him. How various adjustments created a sense of intimacy between visitors and the buildings around them while still preserving the overall visual presentation. These were little adjustments that artists and architects worked into their designs: smaller doorways and windows, a slight reduction to the height of upper stories on a building, and rock and brickwork cleverly sized to make guests believe that a structure was taller than it was. Walt would look over drawings, approve them one by one, and ask how a concept might become an actual structure. One day, while reviewing Ryman's work, he asked, "Can we do that?" "Well, sure," Ryman said. "We can do anything." More than once, Ryman explained how various sets had been produced at MGM and Fox, structures arranged to create a unique effect on screen. After Walt understood that Ryman had already considered how the concept would be built, Walt said, "Good, let's go ahead with that." But Ryman didn't simply push forward Walt's ideas without reflection. He also helped Walt understand why certain designs couldn't be built. Even with all of the design tricks he'd learned at MGM and Fox, sometimes I was awfully good at unselling something. I don't hesitate to tell this, Ryman said. Over coffee, Ryman might explain why a certain design element wouldn't work well when placed beside other design elements. If a quick chat didn't persuade Walt, Ryman would draw a sketch. By me doing the drawing, Ryman said, he could see what was wrong. Though Walt was an avid reader, he was primarily a visual person. He found the language of drawings and models far more persuasive than words by themselves. As a result of these conversations, Ryman became one of a select group of artists, along with Harper Goff, Dick Irvine, and Marvin Davis, to whom Walt turned for advice. Artists who didn't just conceptualize an image, but also considered the steps that would transform a drawing or a painting into architectural or work drawings that could be used at the park. In a playful tone, Walt occasionally introduced Ryman as a sensible designer. "Herb is one of our artists here," he might say to a guest. "Sometimes he's practical." By the beginning of 1955, Ryman could feel the early stirrings that his future held the possibility of change. For a long time, he had nursed the dream whereby he would become a gallery artist, carving out a national reputation as a painter. His work at the studios, up until this point, was mostly arranged out of financial necessity. But in recent weeks, he was beginning to understand, quite by accident, that beyond his closeness to Walt, he was now in a unique place. An artist who, along with a handful of art directors and architects, was creating a new type of American experience. On TV each week, millions of families around the country saw images of Disneyland on Walt's weekly show, images that were so powerful that even before the park opened, others wanted to imitate them. One of those so influenced was Ruth Cameron, a local restaurateur who wanted to build a Disneyland-style attraction of her own. Cameron understood the essence of Walt's creation. It wasn't based on rides so much as environments that imitated the presentation of film. Cameron wanted to use cinematic set-making strategies to create a $5 million fisherman's village in Long Beach, California, near the water. It would include a miniature harbor, boathouses, and dozens of small buildings fashioned after Cape Cod shops. Beyond this, the twin centerpiece attractions would be a 600-seat dinner theater restaurant with a revolving stage, and inside of an overturned ship, a 400-seat seafood bistro. She invited Herb Ryman, along with Harper Goff, the art director for Adventureland, to develop the village much in the cinematic style of Disneyland. Ryman wasn't a permanent employee of any studio, including Disney's. For many years, he had worked on a project-to-project basis. This was generally the life of a Hollywood artist, moving from one film to the next. Art directors were always free to take on outside work. Neither man likely saw any conflict in accepting contract work from Cameron to help conceptualize this fisherman's village. The village, after all, was a shopping and dining area, not an amusement park. But the arrangement also conveyed an important message to Ryman. Even before Walt's Park was open, before buildings were fully framed in on Main Street, the concept of the park, based largely on film sets, so deeply connected with the American public, some investors were looking for ways to imitate the Disney approach months before the park was finished. But this time, Ryman didn't ask for time off to work on the village. He and Goff simply completed this work after hours and on the weekends. One of the first elements that Ryman completed was an aerial bird's-eye map configured as a line drawing, with bridges, a traditional Hawaiian longhouse, a man-made lagoon, and as the visual focal point, a towering lighthouse rising like a castle above the entire development. The illustration would be used as a presentation piece to build public interest and to entice potential investors. Exactly as had the bird's-eye map of Disneyland that he'd once made for Walt. From this point forward, Ryman began to identify himself more strongly as a designer for Walt's Park as he sensed that there was something vital in Walt's concept, something that connected with people in a unique way. Ryman still exhibited personal paintings, including one featured in a gallery show overseen by the National Academy of Design in New York. But his internal compass began to shift, at least for a time, from galleries toward his work with Walt. If Walt was irked by Ryman working on that fisherman's village with Ruth Cameron, he never let on that it upset him. Regularly, Walt rode with Ryman from the studio down to the construction site, a 90-minute drive as the freeway connecting Anaheim to Burbank wasn't yet finished. At the construction site, Walt walked with other designers and construction leads through land that was quickly becoming an amusement park. The design team would talk to various construction foremen and landscape specialists. Walt typically introduced everyone in his group. When he introduced Ryman, he did so in one of two ways. He introduced Herbie as one of the practical artists, or with a subtle note of envy, as an artist fortunate enough to have been taken in by Ringling Brothers. He'd say, "This is my friend Herb Ryman. He traveled with the circus." Over time, Ryman became frustrated that Walt was unable to introduce him in any way other than being the practical artist or the one who traveled with the circus. He was irritated that Walt couldn't see his personality beyond these two touchstones. One day, after being introduced yet again as the man who spent 2 summers with Ringling Brothers, Ryman turned to Walt and asked, "Can't you think of any other way to introduce me than to say I traveled with the circus? Can't you say he's a great watercolorist, or he's a great artist, or anything else?" Walt thought about this, then said, "Well, you did travel with the circus, didn't you?" "Yes," Ryman said. Satisfied with this answer, Walt added, "Well, they didn't invite me." One attraction on which Ryman spent considerable time was Space Station X-1, a walk-through adventure in Tomorrowland that, through artistic trickery, offered guests a satellite view of Earth. Though Ryman was not an architect, he arranged at least one of his drawings in a way that absorbed the tones, but not the precise scale of an elevation, a way of moving the project forward. The illustration showed the entrance to the attraction, people queued up into the dark recesses of the theater. From a creative standpoint, the attraction would be little more than a platform in a darkened room, suspended over a mural-length painting of Earth, with the planet positioned to present North America. Ryman had the idea that tiny dolls might stand in for people, showing a diversity of identities and occupations across the country. The American Indians and so forth, or the Pilgrims, Ryman suggested. But Walt didn't consider this idea, dismissing it as though Ryman should have seen the obvious shortcomings. "It's all dolls," Walt said. "I hate dolls. I don't want to see a lot of dolls. People don't want to see that." In the final months of construction, it was clear to all designers that the park was a financial drain on Walt. Construction was slower and more expensive than anyone had expected, which forced Walt to amend designs for the park. Though Walt had initially wanted Fantasyland to present the charm of Old World Europe, something similar to the dwarf's cottage and Pinocchio's village that 15 years ago he had wanted to build at the studio, he begrudgingly agreed to ornament the area like a medieval fair, with inexpensive striped banners and canopies. The medieval theme also related to a subgenre of film then popular with moviegoers, the medieval drama. The early 1950s featured films such as Prince Valiant, Ivanhoe, and even Disney's The Story of Robin Hood, which, like Treasure Island, had been produced in England. The visual tones of these films would now show up in Walt's park, but these changes weren't driven by a desire to make Fantasyland more appealing to guests. They were driven by a financial necessity to complete the park in budget. Ryman created some of the concepts for the revised medieval facades and canopies. Fantasyland, Ryman said, was cheap and shoddy, and I was embarrassed. I had to design or help design some of the fronts. For this, he worked with Bill Martin, who was now the art director for Fantasyland. According to Ryman, Martin was embarrassed as well. To dress the area, Ryman explained, we had to put up little sticks and little scallops. We didn't have any money. But Fantasyland was an outlier. There were other areas of the park that, as they came together, Herbie adored. The facades on Main Street, the trains that circled the park, and the Mark Twain paddle wheeler that moved down the river. No steamship that ever plied the Mississippi River was as elegant as that little jewel that Walt built for Disneyland, Ryman said. In these areas, at least, the world of the movies seemed real. The biggest design problem remained the area of Tomorrowland. Not only had the sales team been unable to fill all of the exhibit areas, many of the attractions and exhibits wouldn't be ready for the park's opening. Tomorrowland was also the area with the weakest connection to film. To remedy these problems, Walt greenlit 2 last-minute attractions. For the first, a team from the studio would move the actual sets, props, and model ships from the recently released Disney film 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea into an unused exhibition space in Tomorrowland. The sets would not only offer a glimpse into the artistry of Hollywood, they would offer one vision of future technology, at least as imagined by Jules Verne at the end of the 19th century. The second edition would take advantage of a local art exhibition then being housed in a gallery on the second floor of the Santa Monica Library. It was a show created by the Society of Motion Picture Art Directors, which largely through designs and paintings revealed everything the art director does, including concept drawings, location works, and continuity sketches with examples coming from recent studio films. The exhibit would close in Santa Monica shortly before Disneyland opened, so Walt offered to host a version of this show in another unused Tomorrowland venue. The exhibit, at least as it was arranged at Disneyland, would also feature previous film designs created by some who developed the park. The exhibit would include Ryman's sketches for The Robe, which was one of the last projects he worked on at Fox. Along with the film-related artwork, the exhibit would include a designer's model of Tomorrowland. In that way, the exhibit suggested to the public that the same skills necessary to develop Hollywood films had been used to create this park. That the artwork of Disneyland was deeply related to the artwork necessary to create a motion picture. The final weeks of construction were a madhouse, with everyone focused on finishing the park, or as much of the park as possible, before July 17th. Some construction workers clocked in 12 and 14-hour days, with some of them sleeping in their trucks so they could start work again shortly after they woke up. Adding to the problems were 2 regional strikes arranged by unions representing truck drivers and plumbers. These strikes had little to do with Disneyland, other than Disneyland was in a region where the strikes took place. To work around these problems, Walt agreed to truck in asphalt at great expense from San Diego using out-of-the-area drivers. He also agreed to have pay toilets installed in his park, as pay toilets could be installed by non-striking plumbers. One Monday, while Walt drove Ryman down to the construction site, Ryman asked about his weekend, what Walt had done and where he'd gone, specifically if he'd gone down to his vacation house in Palm Springs. Walt responded, "No, Herbie, I sold my house." "You sold that lovely house? Oh, that's a shame. That was a beautiful place." The 2 men looked out the window, mostly at tracts of farmland that stretched out for miles. "I needed the money," Walt continued. "I need every penny I can get." Then Walt playfully lifted an eyebrow. "I'd sell my wife if I thought I could get anything for her." He smiled then, letting Herbie know he was joking. But the squint of his eyes also expressed how much he wanted this park. In the final days of construction, Ryman helped with many projects. He walked with Walt through Main Street, where some shops remained empty and others were unfinished workspaces. He walked with Walt through Adventureland, where the Jungle River ride was still missing most of its animals. He walked with Walt through Frontierland, where he spent time inside of the Golden Horseshoe Saloon. Walt was particularly interested in the saloon, as just 4 days before the park opened, he was planning to hold his 30th wedding anniversary in it. He walked through the saloon, noticing the position of each table and how overhead spots illuminated the space. Then he noticed a line of old liquor bottles behind the bar. Walt questioned whether these were necessary. Ryman suggested that the bottles elevated the saloon's authenticity. "They are the bottles of the turn of the century," Ryman said. Walt, sensitive to how liquor bottles, even antique liquor bottles, might damage the moral framework of his family park, added, "We've got to change the labels on those bottles." Again, Ryman protested, but Walt cut him off. "Herb, there are going to be a lot of people coming here. I would like it if they didn't see anything that anyone could disapprove of." In this, Ryman was reminded that the park wasn't only a representation of Hollywood films, it was a representation of Walt as a person. So, for hours together, they removed the old bourbon and whiskey labels and replaced them with new non-alcoholic labels in preparation for the guests that would soon enter the park. The first of these guests would be a couple hundred of Walt's friends, there for his 30th wedding anniversary. But then, a few days later, the park would open for thousands of guests when Walt's largest dream, finished or not, premiered to the world. So, that's where we're going to leave the story today, shortly before Walt's park opened to the world. And if you're listening to this podcast the week that it is released, hopefully you feel a little closeness with those people who designed the park 68 years ago, as the park will turn 68 years old a little later this week. I'll be back in a week with a new episode. But one last thing before I go. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to become a monthly Bandcamp subscriber is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.